Occasionally, a theological question or a story from a text gets stuck in my head. And the story of Exodus has been stuck in my head for months, really, since the spring. It's because I noticed something peculiar when I reread it this spring. For most people, the story of Exodus is about liberation of the Israelites from Egypt. It's also a story of greed and revenge and hardened hearts. So to briefly summarize the story, the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. Moses is sort of appointed by God to be the leader of the Israelites, and Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Spoiler alert, Pharaoh does not let the Israelites go at first. So God brings 10 plagues, each one more horrible than the last, culminating in the death of every firstborn child of Egypt. And when I reread this, apparently it was so widespread, it was even the firstborn of their livestock. That's intense. Between each of these plagues, Moses meets with Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go, or you're going to be sorry." We all know that part, the "let my people go," and Pharaoh says no. But the part that stuck with me this year was a little side note that happens in each one of those meetings. Each time after Moses issues his warning, the story says, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In fact, that was God's promise to Moses from the very beginning of this story. This is a quote. God says, "You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. When, not if, but when Pharaoh does not listen to you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and bring my people, the Israelites, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment." All these years, all these centuries, we've been blaming Pharaoh. We thought he was stubborn and unyielding. But it says in the story, 5 or 6 times, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's like God wanted to create bad reality television, or to pick a fight, to incite more anger and more violence and more death. Now, if you've read the Hebrew Bible, even if you know the stories, God does some pretty messed up stuff. To me, this story of Exodus is one of the worst. I cannot reconcile intentionally hardening the heart of a leader to justify punishing entire communities. As tragic as this story is, as disappointing as this image of God is, something about it rings true. The depiction of revenge and resentment, especially the unnecessary hardening of hearts, is a common story. Even today, the hard-heartedness of powerful leaders and their inability to move beyond punishing others brings disastrous consequences. The consequences aren't just for the enemy, those people. The consequences are for everyone. Eventually, what we impose on the world, we bring home with us. Now, we don't have to deal with plagues of frogs or locusts, but if we inflict harm on others, they will resist. They will fight back. People have always resisted injustice and dehumanization in whatever way they could. That inclination to resist oppression is a beautiful and a terrible thing. It's beautiful when we align ourselves with the oppressed and when we identify with those Israelites fighting for their liberation. It's terrible when we see that this human inclination to fight back can and does create a pendulum of destruction. I don't personally believe in cosmic justice. I don't personally believe that God smites the wicked and lifts up the holy always. But I do believe that we have to live in the world that we create. If we share joy with the world, then there's maybe some more joy for us there when we need it. If we spread fear and violence, there's a very good chance that our lives will be scary and dangerous. We have to live in the world that we create. Sometimes that means overcoming the mysteriously powerful hardening of our own hearts to break a cycle. Our Unitarian Universalist community, I think you know this, strives to be on the cutting edge of social justice. We do it really well on a national level and in our history. It's part of our heritage that I am deeply proud of. It's probably why a lot of you are here today. Sometimes, though, when we try to be on the cutting edge of social justice, we end up cutting each other to pieces. It's not a uniquely Unitarian Universalist phenomenon. All kinds of progressive circles lash out at one another for not having the right opinion or using the right words. A few weeks ago, I met with some colleagues. We get together every month just to check in, and they were sharing their stories about General Assembly. I don't remember exactly what the issue was this year, but we all sort of agreed as colleagues that being with thousands of Unitarians for several days is exhausting. Beyond requiring a lot of social stamina, it feels like navigating a minefield sometimes. A misstep could lead to an explosive reaction. So colleagues at this meeting talked about this call-out culture and how we might do better. We realized part of what we love about our faith tradition is the commitment to seeking truth and exploring and discussing what we think. And when conversations are shut down with, "You can't say that," we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot. Instead of learning from one another, we shut the conversation down with, "You can't say that." I'm trying to take this learning from colleagues to heart. I'm trying to avoid silencing other people or labeling them, and instead sharing some information or sharing how I feel. The other day, I conducted a very small, low-risk experiment of having a different kind of conversation. In the whole Trump-Putin fiasco, we've seen a flurry of political cartoons, and these two larger-than-life characters are great fodder for political cartoons. A lot of them depict Trump and Putin in a romantic situation, usually with Trump being portrayed as the more feminine or submissive role. They're funny. But after about the 10th version of this same cartoon, or hearing just as many verbal depictions of their romantic or sexual relationship, I started to get pretty uncomfortable. Part of me wanted to raise my rainbow flag and scream, "Homophobia!" That is the type of reaction that social media thrives on, right? Accusatory, outraged, unspecified anger. Then I remembered this conversation with colleagues. I remembered that we're hungry for a different type of learning together. So on Facebook, I shared a post explaining why this was problematic, and I wrote these words. Please don't take this as calling out. This is my explaining why depictions of Trump and Putin in a sexual relationship makes me uncomfortable. It's basically an adult, politicized version of saying, "That's so gay," or calling Trump the F word. I get the joke, but it makes me feel like I'm being used as the punchline. We can do better. I know that quoting yourself is strange, and quoting yourself from a Facebook post is even stranger, but bear with me. This was an experiment. It felt good to be fully honest. Showing more than a knee-jerk emotion of anger took some effort, but offering this fuller picture of myself felt good. I get the joke, it's not lost on me, and part of me wants to laugh with you. But the way you make the joke kind of hurts, because you're using me and my story to make fun of someone else. It's satisfying to express a little bit more. Silencing people and shaming them is dangerous territory. You can't say that. Stops us learning from one another. It takes a lot more energy, but I'm learning slowly that explaining how an idea is hurtful goes a lot farther. Like I said, my Facebook post was a very low-risk experiment. I think stopping this pendulum of retaliation is going to take a lot more effort. One of the places I looked for tips this week is the way we provide therapy for war veterans or survivors of trauma. In the past couple of decades, psychologists have dramatically changed the way they conducted therapy with survivors. Until recently, the standard was to have a survivor tell their story over and over and over. It was thought that if they could just express it enough, they could get it out of their system in a sort of cathartic purging of the emotions. It turns out, rehashing the same story doesn't clear the mind, it does the opposite. As the survivor retells the story, it just gets embedded deeper. We now know that revisiting the story is only helpful if there's an opportunity to see it differently. Looking for possibilities of hope. Hope may just mean focusing on the fact of survival. After all, survival itself is sometimes a triumph. Hope can also be more creative. Instead of sticking to the exact details of what happened, stories can be retold in a way that experiments with details. What if slightly different things had happened? What if there was a backstory that led to this? We can honor histories of oppression and at the same time construct a more hopeful scenario. We can look for slivers of hope and redemption in the midst of pain. It doesn't erase or change the past, but focusing on hope and possibility does give a path forward. So much depends on how we understand stories of the past. I don't know how many times I have heard the story of Exodus. I remember hearing a very simplified children's version in bedtime stories. I remember seeing the Ten Commandments, the movie. I've taken probably 2 graduate level courses on the Hebrew Bible. And until this year, it never occurred to me that Pharaoh didn't really have a choice. It says it right there in the story. God hardened Pharaoh's heart, essentially so that God could have the opportunity to flex his cosmic muscles. The Egyptians, like the Israelites, were caught in a cycle of punishment and revenge. Our stories aren't so grand. We don't face plagues of frogs or locusts, but individually and collectively, we do reap what we sow. Until we find a different way of understanding the story, the pendulum will keep swinging right into our own backyards. Amen.